So if I switch back and forth between Menhaden bunker, same thing. If you don't know, it's the largest fishery in the Atlantic, and it's also one of the most important forage fish in the Atlantic. And until 2012, it was largely an unregulated fishery. Most of the fish, the majority, over 75%, go to make industrial products like pig food and pet food and fish oil pills. And in 2012, we got some regulations put in place, and it started to see some important recovery. But there's still a lot more that we can do in New York and as New York. And a couple of years ago, I was at my marine mechanics getting my boat winterized, and he gave me an earful about how important Menhaden were to his job. And it made me think, geez, maybe I should get a couple of these guys and put a film together. And I'm going to actually show that to you. And then so we picked 4 people whose livelihoods and interests rely on Menhaden being abundant in and around New York, all New Yorkers. And when we started to talk to them and interview them, I realized every single one of them wanted to talk about the history of this fishery because it's incredibly interesting, and they all had it slightly wrong. And so we grabbed a 5th person, Bill Wise, who at the time was director of New York Sea Grant and just finished writing a book and doing a lot of research on the history of the Menhaden fishery in New York. And so this little 8-minute film, and I'll give you an update afterwards of what's going on, but we're going to show you an 8-minute film with these 5 individuals, and I think the sharks would like it, probably. Hopefully the volume will work.
There have been conflicts associated with the Menhaden fishery since there has been a Menhaden fishery.
The forage fish, the small fish, the bottom of the food chain, they're absolutely essential.
I guess the sport fishing industry got me into Menhaden because there's always somebody going shark fishing that wanted a cooler full of bunker.
Bottom line is bunker is a bait fish, and when there's high levels of bait fish, there are species to catch.
Right now, we got it good. These whales are here to feed on these fish.
And this is a species of fish that was subject to intense fishing pressure for well over a century. There's no question that that affected the abundance of Menhaden on the East Coast. Menhaden fishing has been very important on Long Island since at least the American Revolution. This is a naturally very abundant fish here in New York seasonally from April through the end of October, and attracted the attention initially of colonial farmers to fertilize their fields. The fishery initially was a beach seine fishery. As the 19th century progressed, however, the focus of the fishery and what they were trying to get out of it changed, particularly with the onset of the Civil War. As the U.S. economy industrialized, there's a tremendous need for oil, and Menhaden is about the oiliest fish in the sea. What this meant was that they would no longer bring the fish ashore to throw them onto their fields. There developed a series of small factories where the fish were cooked, the oil extracted, and then what remained was used as fertilizer. And eventually these small potworks, many of them developed into very sophisticated factories. As the fishery became more intense, the geographic range and the movements of the fish begin to be affected. So in 1880, 50% of the fish caught in the Atlantic Menhaden fishery were caught in New England. By 1900, that percentage had dropped into the 20s. There's pretty clear evidence that by the early 1960s, the fish were being harvested at a size and at a rate that was simply unsustainable.
Well, my grandfather, he operated a fish trap company before World War I. Fish traps back then were very successful. They used to catch tremendous numbers of all the species you would expect, things like weakfish and bluefish and herring and a lot of bait fish for the lobstermen and things like that. We also caught enormous numbers of tuna. The tuna came that close to the beach because there were forage fish in tremendous numbers close to the beach back then. And today the bunker might be the most important fish just for the simple reason it's a great filter feeder. We put way too much nutrients in the bay, so we're really lucky when something like a Menhaden can come in and consume some of the phytoplankton and plankton that have taken up that nitrogen. Taking all the forage fish really reduced the ability of our environment to produce not only the larger fish, but the whales and the seabirds and everything else that feeds on them. A few years ago, when they put some restrictions on the commercial fishery for bunker, we were catching striped bass in Great South Bay in the fall. We had more bunker in the bay than we'd had for a long time.
Striped bass has a huge impact on our business because it's reachable by the average boater. I think Suffolk County has the highest number of boats registered in the state of New York. When fishing's good, people use their boats, and we're in a service business. Boats that get used do break, that's how we make our living. Those schools of bunker bring in tremendous amount of bass. And it's not just bass. Look at the whales. They're inshore, they're close. It was amazing to watch last year. Whales chasing bunker up into New York Harbor.
We're about 3 miles from New York City right now, in the western New York Bight, and since 2013, whales are here. The reason why these whales are here are not for the sights of that city right there, which is beautiful, don't get me wrong. It's for the fish that they eat, and that's the only reason. And we need to protect them. We want it to be managed, making sure that our voices are heard and not over-harvest them. It's not just for whale watching. Everything eats menhaden. Everything in this ocean around here is based on that. And if you take it away, everything else goes. The bass get skinny. The blues, they're ravenous. These whales, they would never come by. We gotta make sure that we protect these forage fish so everything in this ocean gets their share. I get it, we need some. There's businesses based on this.
You're looking at the Peconic River. This is one of the main ground zeros for this fishery. When the fish are running, this river will be paved with fish straight across, and there'll be a lot of fishermen flowing through here. Our fish are all for the bait industry, mostly for the crabbers up west and the sport fishing industry. And then all the surplus goes to Maine. Maine has a severe bait shortage. I guess it was around 2012 when the management finally was enacted, and it made a huge difference. It was insane. The schools would come in and just invade this whole system from here to Montauk. And then it was that point we kind of had to step up and start harvesting these fish, because every so often they'll get jammed up into places like the heads of the Peconic River or the Shinnecock Canal, and you'll lose 10 million pounds of fish overnight just because they deplete the oxygen so rapidly. It's a quota issue. I think we can solve this with 1% or so of this quota for New York State. I think these larger stocks are great for a small fishery like we're participating in, because we need giant schools in order to be able to get a little bit of them close to a shore where we could actually reach them. And we can find a responsible number that we're allowed to harvest without affecting any other part of the ecosystem. We're not going to dent this population at 6,000 or even 10,000 pounds a day. And we don't really want to catch millions of pounds. We just want to be able to go at a steady pace throughout the year and be able to go catch fish when the fish are here.
We live on an island. We're surrounded by water. We want to see the bunker and the fishing stay strong.
This is what they call a keystone species of our marine environment here in New York.
More menhaden, more whales.
More striped bass, more bluefish. How much more can you ask of a fish?
It's really important that you get out and let your voice be heard about this. Everything depends on it.
So when we put this film together, we're looking for a couple of different management changes. As I mentioned, we made some progress in 2012, but it's been kind of slow going. In fact, we've rolled backwards a little bit on the interstate level since. One of the things that we are trying to get done by the interstate, all right, how do I stop this?
There have been conflicts associated with the Menhaden fishery since there has been.
Perfect. So at the interstate level, where the fish are managed by what's called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, every state plus a few federal agencies and Potomac River Fisheries Commission get to vote on what gets done. So New York does have a vote on that. We have yet to be able to change the goals of management to, before we calculate how many menhaden come out of the water, first figure out how many we need to leave in the water to feed everything else. We are working towards that and hopefully can get a decision like that in about 1.5 to 2 years during the next amendment process. But what happened when the fish started to come back and their range started to expand back to their historic range, we started to see a lot more fish in New York. And the fishery, as Bill Wise used to say, used to be a pretty big fishery here in New York. And what our baymen were asking for, you heard Will Caldwell at the end, he's the president of the Southampton Baymen's Association, was hey, look, we're talking about 6,000 or 10,000 pounds a day for part of the year when we're harvesting these fish. We thought that that was reasonable because the actual coastwide catch is about 500 million pounds of fish. So these guys were talking about a fraction of a percent. And we were able to put a coalition together that included the commercial fishermen, the recreational fishermen, a lot of scientists, a lot of whale people, a lot of bird people, a lot of birds, including ospreys and eagles and seabirds and shorebirds eat these fish. And convinced the state legislature that they needed to do something because as the fish came back to New York, big out-of-state boats were coming in and starting to take fish and coming right outside the line of state line where those whales are feeding off in New York Harbor. And what's really exciting is this legislative session, which the budget hasn't even passed yet, unanimously in the Senate and in the Assembly. I don't even know how often that happens, but it's not very often. Led by Assemblyman Engelbart in the Assembly and Senator Todd Kaminsky from Long Beach in the Senate, passed bills that would prevent those large-scale boats from coming into New York and taking our fish and steaming back. They don't even stop for a cup of coffee. They kind of come in, take the fish, and steam home. And we're waiting for the governor to sign it. We think he will. He likes to fish, and we know that unanimous both houses. So the main things we're working on, and people should pay attention to if they're like this issue, is the governor signing the bill this session that would take effect immediately. That would keep the big boats from coming into New York. These are no one in New York fishes with these kinds of gear. And then the other thing in the longer term is getting those changes made at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission for what's called ecological reference points. Basically, thinking about all the other critters before we decide how many fish can come out of the water. And yeah, if any questions, or I know probably you guys are all ready to get the heck out of here, and I know Enrico wants to go to a brewery or something. So.
Questions for Carl?
Question. Thank you, Carl, for all your great work on this. For our benefit, can you explain how the allocation with the respective states works?
Yeah, so like many fisheries, and it came up in one of the earlier talks, when new management plans get put in place, particularly when something hasn't been managed before, people decide, all right, well, how many fish can get taken out, and then who gets to take them out? And so who gets to take them out is typically based on some recent information on who was taking the fish. right before the management went into place. And so in this instance, a single company that's based out of Virginia, recently bought by Cook Seafood Incorporated, was taking about 80% of the fish for this reduction fishery to create products, and about the remaining 20% were being taken up and down the coast by fishermen who were catching them for bait, and then supplying bait to the New England lobster fishery, the crab fishery, and whatnot. So the way that played out was, at that time when that split happened, Virginia ended up getting 86% of the coastwide quota because of that single company, and then because a lot of the bait fishing was happening in the state of Virginia. New Jersey got 11%. Because they have a big bait fishing industry in New Jersey. And so the remaining 5% or so got split between all the other states on the Atlantic coast. And New York at that time got 0.06% of the coastwide quota. That's when you heard Will say, hey, we're talking like, hey, if we get 1% of the quota, that would be great. The rules have since been updated a little bit, and New York now has about just under 0.5% or just over 0.5%, I believe. That's a pretty significant amount of fish with a quota that's almost 500 million pounds. It's about 3.5 or so million pounds, and so that's where the New York State quota is right now. Does that answer your question?
Yes. All right, with no other questions, Carl, thank you.